We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Welcome to Conspiracy Corner Podcast, everyone. This is Abe, your host. It is November 23rd. It is 5 p.m. I got up super early. I just woke up from a weird dream and couldn't go back to sleep. So, felt like I should get up and do a podcast for you all. Last episode was kind of a heavy hitter, so I like to do a fun one after heavy hitters and then kind of crisscross. You guys know how I do. So today we're covering true crime. We are covering the story of Kate Webster. Basically, I'll just give you a hint. Someone's going to get dismembered. But as far as updates, I don't really have much to say, and we'll get on with the show. This is the box I want you to carry. Kate Webster. Julia Martha Thomas was an elderly widow who lived at 2 Vine Cottages, Park Road, Richmond. She was regarded by her neighbors as a person with an excitable temperament, and she had a reputation for being a tartar to her servants. She was also something of an eccentric who liked to move house, and did so with such frequency that her relatives often did not know where she was. She had been married twice, her second husband having died in 1873. Since then, she had lived alone except for taking an occasional lodger to help eke out her small income. Mrs. Thomas had a fondness for jewelry, and she liked to impress on people, especially local tradesmen, that she was already quite comfortably off. She also kept a servant, or at least for as long as anyone was prepared to put up with her eccentricity. In January 1879, Mrs. Thomas was looking for a maid and mentioned the fact to a friend, Lucy Maria Loder, who lived nearby. At that time, Miss Loder, a builder's daughter, employed Mrs. Sarah Crease as a chairwoman on several occasions when she had been unable to go herself. Mrs. Crease asked a friend to take her place. That friend was Kate Webster, a 30-year-old Irish woman who came with her small son to live with Sarah and Charles Crease at 3 Mitchell Road, Richmond, on the 13th of January, 1879. There you go, 13, unlucky 13. Miss Loder found Kate's work satisfactory, and knowing that she wanted a position in service as a general, mentioned her to Mrs. Thomas, without the benefit of references, normally regarded as essential in so serious as business as hiring a servant. The widow decided to engage her. Kate Webster, leaving her son in the care of Mrs. Crease, entered Mrs. Thomas' service at 27th of January, 1879. What the elderly lady with pretensions to modest wealth and middle-class status did not know was that her new maid was, not to put too fine a point on it, a jailbird with several aliases. Catherine Lawyer, alias Kate Webster, was born in 1849 in the small village of Enniscorthy in County Wexford, Little is known about her family background, but she claimed to have been a teenage bride when she married a sea captain named Webster, by whom she had 4 children, all of whom were since supposed to have perished. She soon embarked on a criminal career and was imprisoned in Ireland for conviction of larceny. On being released, she traveled to England and made a living in Liverpool by exploiting her criminal talents. In 1867, she was sentenced in that city for 4 years penal servitude, on completion of which she made her way to London, with the professed intention of making an honest living. The next few years were fairly quiet, and in 1873 she took lodgings at Rose Gardens and Hammersmith. Her next-door neighbors at Brightwell Cottages were Henry and Ann Porter, who had 3 children. Henry Porter knew her only as Kate and believed her to be the maidservant currently out of work. After 5 or 6 weeks, Kate told the Porters that she was moving to Notting Hill, where she had secured employment as cook housemaid in the home of Captain Woolbest at Royal Crescent, Notting Hill. She visited the Porters occasionally, but then contact was lost. During this time, according to Kate herself, she met a man named Strong, who persuaded her to live with him in rooms at 5 Acre Road, Kingston. She became pregnant by him and gave birth to a son on April 19, 1874. She was then abandoned to her own devices and supported herself as best she could, but mostly by stealing. Posing as the wife of a sea captain, she obtained goods from tradespeople under false pretenses. During the next 3 years, she was in and out of prison, sentenced to 18 months hard labor in 1875, and a further 12 months imprisonment in 1877. Following the last spell in Her Majesty's prison at Wandsworth, she went to live at Teddington, ostensibly a charwoman to the Mitchell family. I'm not sure what charwoman is. Her stated purpose was to steal, but the poor Mitchells were so impoverished, according to her, that they had nothing worth taking. She also alleged that Mitchell was the father of her child. During this phase of her life, Kate was constantly on the move, using different names: Webb, Webster, Gibbs, Gibbons, and Lyler, and changing her lodgings frequently. She was also in and out of prison fairly often, which created problems regarding the care of her boy. Fortunately, she had met a charwoman, Sarah Crease, whom she came to look on as a good friend. Certainly Sarah minded Kate's son when his mother was, quote-unquote, in service, as imprisonment was euphemistically called. While staying with the Mitchell family, in 1878, Kate met George Crease, Sarah's 20-year-old son, who was potman at the King's Hotel, Twickenham. She developed a crush on the lad, who was nearly 10 years younger than herself, and pestered him at the hotel where he was working. She made herself such a nuisance that she was told to stay away, and poor George was so diverted from his duties that he was dismissed. After her affair with young George, nothing is known of her whereabouts until January 13, 1879, when she went to stay with Sarah Crease at Richmond, and thence into service with the eccentric Julia Thomas. The maid who presented herself for duty at Mrs. Thomas' 2-story, semi-detached Greystone house on the 27th of January, 1879, was a rather hard-looking, freckle-faced Irish woman with more than average experience of life. Being wise after the event, and in the view of savagery which subsequently took place, a number of commentators remarked on Kate's sinister eyes. By the way, I'll leave an image of what she looks like if you're watching, if you're a visual viewer on YouTube or YouTube. Yeah, she's definitely got like some killer eyes, man. Her new mistress, for all her primness, sensed nothing immediately untoward. The real relationship which existed between these two women can only be imagined. There was no doubting that Kate had little worthwhile experience as a servant, her service, for the most part, having been spent in prison, but she may have had a genuine desire to reform. On the other hand, she may equally have had a genuine desire to set the old lady up for robbery. At first, Kate got on well with Mrs. Thomas. She told Sarah Creese that her mistress was a good-hearted person and thought she would be happy at Vine Cottages. But then difficulties started to creep in. Kate can be pictured doing her unfamiliar household chores with all the grace of an old lag, and Mrs. Thomas reining in her rising irritation for the sake of keeping on good terms. Kate would confess later that Mrs. Thomas showed evidence of a nasty spirit towards her. No doubt words were exchanged, and it is quite probable that Kate used a mastery of language unknown to genteel Mrs. Thomas. Inevitably, the spell had broken, and it was the old lady who took the initiative by dispensing with Kate's services. It was agreed that she would leave and work out notice until the end of February. This interesting period must have put further strain on their relationship, and the balance of power started to tip in favor of Kate. There is no doubt that at this time, either by words, deeds, or looks, Kate began to frighten the old lady. Mrs. Thomas asked various acquaintances, including several members of the church she attended, to come and stay with her. She succeeded in persuading a woman and her daughter to live in the cottage for 2 weeks. While Mrs. Thomas may have felt there was safety in numbers and possibly exploited her position of command, Kate was not one to be threatened lightly. She was due to leave on Friday, 28th of February, the same day as Mrs. Thomas's 2 guests. Using a number of powerful ruses, such as the difficulty of getting new lodges at the end of the week, Kate appealed to her mistress to let her stay on at least over the weekend. This request was made on the very last day of Kate's period of notice. Mrs. Thomas recorded the ill-fated decision in her diary. Her 2 companions had already departed from Vine Cottages, leaving the old lady alone with Kate, and with all the fear that caused her to seek their presence in the first place. On Sunday morning, Mrs. Thomas went to church as usual. She attended the Presbyterian service in the lecture hall, Hill Street, Richmond. It had been an accepted arrangement since she started work at the Vine Cottages, that Kate should have Sunday afternoons free provided she returned in time for Mrs. Thomas to attend evening service. Kate usually took the opportunity to visit her son, who was staying with Sarah Creese. On this particular Sunday, March the 2nd, 1879, Kate decided to play truant and call in at a public house where she conversed with some men at the bar. Consequently, she was late returning to the cottage and found Mrs. Thomas dressed, ready for church, and agitated at being kept waiting. It is likely that, putting aside earlier apprehensions, she thoroughly reprimanded Kate for her behavior. Kate's reaction at being chastised is not known in detail, but it is certain that what she said was sufficiently violent to intimidate Mrs. Thomas. Julia Nichols, a worshiper at the Presbyterian Church, and a former servant to the Mrs. Thomas, saw the old lady arrive late. The service had already begun when she appeared looking flushed and anxious. Mrs. Nichols said, "I noticed that her bonnet appeared to have slipped off her head. Her voice was shaking. She appeared to be in a state of great excitement." Mrs. Thomas usually took a seat up at the front of the congregation near the pulpit, but on this occasion sat at the back near the door. She left about 10 minutes before the end of the service and returned home. Why Miss Thomas went back that evening without asking one of her church friends to accompany her is one of the abiding mysteries of the affair. It has been suggested that she was fascinated by Kate, transfixed by her like the predator's victim. At any rate, she reached the cottage, quote unquote, before her usual hour, according to Kate, and went upstairs. Kate followed her, and an argument developed which, Kate confessed later, ripened into a quarrel. Remember, too, Kate's drunk, so. Mrs. Elizabeth Ives, who lived next door, heard a noise which she thought sounded like the fall of a heavy chair. After that, silence. Realizing that the old lady was seriously injured, Kate, according to her own account, caught her by the throat to prevent her from screaming, and in the struggle choked her. This makes the incident appear more like an accident. What is more probable, the bloodstains found upstairs tend to support it, is that Kate lay in wait and felled Mrs. Thomas before she could cry out. Any quarrel with voices raised followed by a struggle of the kind mentioned by Kate would surely have resulted in more noise filtering through the next door. The horror of what happened next is encapsulated in Kate's subsequent confession. In retrospect, even she could not fully comprehend the inhuman nature of what she did, acknowledging that she, quote unquote, was helped by the devil. Taking the dead or dying body of Mrs. Thomas into the kitchen and laying it out onto the table, she chopped the head off with a razor. This symbolic act of revenge may have been retribution for real or imagined grievances against her former employer. But the enormity of the act must surely have represented some more primitive need. She was not finished yet. Using a meat saw and a carving knife, she proceeded to hack the body to pieces. Having cut open the stomach, she scooped up great loops of entrails and burned them. The murderess had taken the precaution of drawing the blinds and night-cloaked the devil's work. She had put a fire under the kitchen copper, and within hours of leaving church, Mrs. Thomas's mortal parts were being boiled. She did everything she possibly could to conceal what had happened, hoping the neighbors had heard nothing. She nearly fainted from the smell of the exertion of the night's long work. Eventually, she emptied and cleaned up the copper and set about clearing away the traces of murder. Finally, she put the boiled parts of the body into a wooden box and secured it tightly with a cord. As dawn began to strip away her cover, Kate was wearily still cleaning up the mess and burning the last of the bones and remnants of flesh. Mrs. Ives, who had slept soundly in her house a few feet away from the charnel house next door, said, "All that morning there was a strange smell, and I mentioned it to one of my apprentices, but gradually Kate succeeded in regulating the place, and by late morning was hanging, washing out to dry in the usual way." Tired out after her exertions, Kate probably slept until she was awakened by a loud knocking on the door at about 12 p.m. William Dean, a coal agent from Richmond, was calling to settle Mrs. Thomas's fuel account. Kate opened the door cautiously. "Is Mrs. Thomas in?" asked Dean. "No." Realizing he was talking to the servant, Dean said, "You give my compliments to Mrs. Thomas and tell her when she arrives home Mr. Dean called." There was no reply and the door was slammed shut. Dean said Kate seemed excited and answered me very abruptly, I thought. One of the things which may have excited or worried Kate was that after she had packed the box with Mrs. Thomas's remains, there were a few leftovers, including a foot and one or two other bits and pieces. It seems that Kate went on a little excursion to dump these morsels. The foot was found in a manure heap on some small allotment near Kingston, but the other pieces were never recovered. On her return, she called in at the Hole in the Wall public house for refreshment, and as the proprietress Mrs. Hayhoe was to say later, "I little thought when Kate came in and I chatted to her that she had left her mistress boiling in the copper." Kate's purpose in boiling the parts of the body which now lay crammed in the wooden box was to conceal their identity. But the most identifiable component, the head, worried her mightily. She put it in a black bag, the deposition of which she said gave me great uneasiness. Early next morning, Tuesday, March 4th, Kate was seen through the windows of the cottage busily cleaning and going about her servant's work. But in the afternoon she was transformed from servant to quasi-mistress. Attired in one of the late Mrs. Thomas's silk dresses, and wearing the old lady's watch and jewelry, she decided to do some visiting. She called on the Porter family at Hammersmith, whom she had not seen for 6 years. Strangely, for one so elegantly dressed and bent on renewing old acquaintances, she took with her a black bag. On arriving at Rose Gardens between 5:30 and 6 p.m., she met 15-year-old Robert Porter. "How are you, Bob?" she asked him. "Quite well, thank you," he answered politely, not being quite sure who the visitor was. His father was not home, so he took the visitors indoors and noticed that she had put the black bag under the table. When Henry Porter arrived, he was greeted with, "Hello, father, here you are," by Kate, whom he did not immediately recognize. And then, "Kate, I should never have recognized you if you had not spoken first." He observed that she was a great deal more respectably dressed than he recollected when he had seen her previously. Mrs. Porter was in bed, unwell, so Henry, Kate, and young Robert had tea together. Kate told them that an aunt had died and left her a very comfortable home at Richmond, which she wanted to dispose of, as her father wished her to return to Ireland. At about 7:30 p.m., she asked her host if they would like to see her off at the station. Henry Porter noticed that his visitor had a black bag with her, and this was given to young Robert to carry while he walked ahead with Kate. As they walked, Kate spoke about her property and asked Henry if he could find a respectable broker. Being a practical man, he asked, "Can't you find one at Richmond, as it would be much easier?" Indeed, but not for Kate. Her plans required the services of someone unacquainted with local properties. She told Henry that she would prefer to leave it to him, as she did not know anyone in Richmond. Meanwhile, Robert had lagged behind, and they waited for him to catch them up. When he did, the lad said, "Take the bag, father. It is rather heavy." Henry took the bag, which he thought must weigh about 20 to 25 pounds, and the three continued on their way until they reached the Angel, where they stopped for a glass of ale. Kate then said she had a friend she wanted to visit at Barnes, and they made a detour to Oxford and Cambridge. They had another glass of ale, and promising that she would not be long, Kate went off to see her friend. She asked for her bag, and Henry volunteered his son's services to carry it. "Oh no," said Kate, "I can manage that myself. I shan't be gone long." Half an hour later she returned without the bag, and after another pint of ale she produced some photographs and some gold rings and started referring to herself as Mrs. Thomas. At about 9 p.m. they eventually reached the railway station. She pressed Henry Porter to find a broker and asked him if he would allow his son Robert to go home with her. He agreed on the understanding that the lad returned the same evening. Having disposed of the black bag with its grisly contents, the next part of Kate's plan began to emerge. When she and Robert reached the Vine Cottages, she gave him some rum and said, "I want you to help me carry a box to Richmond Bridge, because I have to meet a friend there." She showed him a building society book and post office savings bank book, which she said belonged to her aunt, and asked him to count up the interest. She then left the room, returning about 10 minutes later with the box. A brief diversion followed as she ran her fingers over the piano, remarking to her young companion what a fine tone it had. Returning to the matter in hand, she said to him, "This is the box I want you to carry." It was nearly 11 p.m. Carrying the box between them, holding it awkwardly by the cord as the handles were missing, they set off down Mount Ararat Road to Richmond Bridge. They stopped to take a breather halfway there because the box was so heavy. They changed sides and eventually reached the bridge, walking to the far end and stopping at the last recess on the left side. "Put it down and you go on," instructed Kate. "My friend will be here directly. I'll catch you up." Robert did as he was asked, and while walking back slowly towards the Richmond end of the bridge, he heard a splash. A short while later, Kate caught up with him. She did not have the box with her. They went to the station only to find that the last train had gone. And as Kate did not have enough money for a cab, they returned to Vine Cottages where Robert stayed the night. After a hearty breakfast the next morning, Robert set off for home, and later that morning Kate paid another visit to the Porter family. She pursued Henry on the question of finding a broker and stayed the night, sleeping in the parlor. Early that day, at about 7 a.m., Henry Wheatley, a coal porter who lived at Mortlake, was driving his cart along the bank of the river Thames when, near Barnes Bridge, he saw something at the water's edge which caught his attention. Leaving his mate to mind the car, Wheatley jumped down and strode off to examine what he now saw was a wooden box, lying partially submerged on the bank. He hauled it out of the water with some difficulty, as it was quite heavy, and subjected the object to closer scrutiny. It was a box, made of deal with a hinged lid, which was firmly secured with strong cord. He cut the cords with his penknife and gave the box a hefty kick. The waterlogged container fell to pieces, exposing a mass of raw flesh. Startled by his discovery, Wheatley called his mate, who looked the flesh over and declared it to be ordinary butcher's meat. Wheatley had his doubts and decided to tell the police. He told Inspector Harbour at Barnes Police Station of his discovery, and a doctor was sent for. Dr. James Adams, who practiced at Barnes, examined the remains on the river bank and judged them to be human. They were moved to a mortuary at Barnes for further examination. The remains were female and represented an almost entire body save for the head and one foot, which were missing. The parchment-like appearance of the skin and the lack of decomposition led the doctor to conclude that the flesh had been boiled. This opinion was shared by Dr. Thomas Bond, lecturer in forensic medicine at Westminster Hospital, who examined the gruesome relics a week later. He said, "The soft parts appear to have been hacked. The bones have been sawn roughly, and the division had been made without any relation to anatomical structure. I had no doubt that the parts had been boiled." It was not possible to identify the body as the head was missing, beyond stating that it was a woman, a little over 5 feet in height, with some doubt as to her age. There was little the doctors could say. The immediate reaction was that some misguided medical students had indulged in a prank aimed at the police. Meanwhile, Kate, blissfully ignorant that some of her late employer's remains were now resided in the Barnes mortuary, stayed the night with the Porters, sleeping in the front parlor. The next day, March 6, Thursday, Kate embarked on a further stage of her plan, accompanied by William Porter, aged 22, Henry's eldest son, and a baker at Hammersmith. She returned to the Vine Cottages. She had mislaid her keys, and William had to borrow a ladder and get into the house through a window. This visit seems to have been ill-defined purpose, for Kate merely chatted to William for a couple of hours and showed him some photographs. In reality, she may have been scared to stay in the house on her own, which is the charitable view, or perhaps she just wanted to implicate others to offset suspicion. that might be directed to herself. After William departed, Kate left no time in following him to Hammersmith, where once more she reminded his father about her need for a broker. Again she stayed the night. On Friday, 7th of March, Kate had an early morning visitor at Vine Cottages. This time it was Ann Porter, who produced some keys and a purse which she had found lying on a table. Kate welcomed her in, gave her breakfast, and showed her over the house. She told Mrs. Porter that she planned to dispose of the house and its contents privately, and would leave the contents of the kitchen to her. When Mrs. Porter left to return home to Hammersmith, Kate went with her and remained with the Porter family during the weekend. On Sunday, the 9th of March, Henry Porter took her to the Rising Sun at Rose Gardens, Hammersmith, where he introduced her to John Church, the landlord. Church, a successful small businessman who had also served in the 11th Hussars, had been primed that Kate, or rather Mrs. Thomas, wished to dispose of her home, and it was thought he might be interested in making an offer for the furniture. Kate handled the introduction as if she were an old acquaintance of Church's, and following further meetings, Church agreed to go over to Richmond on Tuesday, 11th of March. Kate was about to enmesh Church in her web, and when he turned up at the Vine Cottages in the evening, he did not even look at the furniture, which was his purpose of the visit. He conversed with Kate, who had her little boy with her, and she showed him some photographs, after which they went out for a drink in the railway tavern, and Church returned home. The next evening he appeared again, this time with Porter, and Kate showed them around the house. She drew their attention to a portrait hanging over the mantelpiece, which she said was of her late husband, Mr. Thomas. In the following days there were many visits to Mr. Henry Weston, who ran a greengrocery in Hammersmith and occasionally used his van for furniture removal, and another conference at Vine Cottages to price the furniture. Eventually, the protracted negotiations resulted in Church making an offer of £50 for the items Kate wanted to sell. She did not think that was enough and hit up the price to £68. A bargain was struck, and Kate asked for an advance in order to pay off some bills. Church gave her £18 as a deposit. Arranging for the sale of the furniture seemed to involve a tremendous amount of toing and froing. In total, Church made 8 visits to the Vine Cottages in his dealings with Mrs. Thomas. Kate played the part convincingly, and with some nerve in view of the newspaper reports of the Barnes mystery. During Mrs. Porter's visit, a paper boy had passed the house shouting, "Supposed murder! Shocking discovery of human remains in a box found in the Thames." Kate had said, "I expect that's only a catchpenny, but we might as well have a paper." She went to the door, called out to the boy, and bought a copy. Porter and Church treated Kate like a friend, and on the Sunday before removal day, they went boating on the river. Tuesday, March 18th, was the day fixed for removing the furniture. Church and a helper named John Marion arriving about midday to dismantle the beds and do the packing. They were later joined by Henry Porter, and at about 7 p.m., Henry Weston rolled up with 2 vans. At this point, things started to go wrong. A chest full of drawers and a few other pieces were loaded into one of the vans when Kate's neighbor, Elizabeth Ives, asked Henry Weston what was going on. He referred her to Kate, who was standing at the door. Kate walked over and said, "Is it Miss Ives who wishes to know where the furniture is going?" "Well, I should like to know," replied Mrs. Ives. "Mrs. Thomas has sold the furniture. The man can show the receipts. Mr. Weston is going to take it to Hammersmith." "Where's Mrs. Thomas?" was the inevitable question. "I do not know," answered Kate, turning away. "Can't you give me her address?" persisted Mrs. Ives. "No. came the answer. Kate's initial aggressiveness turned to apprehension as Miss Ives firmly concluded the conversation, said, "You must excuse me, I will attend to it." Miss Ives, who had leased 2 Vine Cottages to Mrs. Thomas, hurried off to see her agent. Kate returned, said Church, greatly agitated and excited. Sensing trouble in the air, he wisely ordered the articles loaded into the vans to be put back into the house. When Miss Ives returned at about 7:45, it was dark, but she picked out Kate standing in the road with a clutch of her helpers. She returned to the house with Porter and came out bearing an armful of dresses which she flung into one of the vans. With that, the party decamped to the local public house, and then went their separate ways. When Weston returned to Hammersmith, he took the dresses to John Church, whose wife Maria put them in the club room at the Rising Sun, and thought no more about them. A climate of suspicion now began to develop. Accounts of the box found in the River Thames had appeared in the Daily Graphic, which Henry Porter read regularly, and his son Robert related how the box he had carried for Mrs. Thomas fitted the description of the box mentioned in the paper. John Church was also uneasy, and the next evening paid a visit to Miss Ives, but it was a discovery made by Mrs. Church which firmly focused suspicion on Kate. When sorting through the dresses which she had put to one side, she felt in the pocket of one of them and found a letter, a purse, and a diary belonging to the real Mrs. Thomas. Kate had already flown. After the difficulties over moving the furniture, she went straight to the Rising Sun, arriving before John Church, and asked his wife, "Will you lend me a sovereign?" Maria Church gave her half a sovereign, and made up the rest from the till. Kate was not in the mood for conversation, and with the remark, "I'm going to pack up all tonight," rushed off. Her next port of call was the Porter home, where she had left her son. Robert answered the door, and Kate told him she wanted her son. The lad explained that he was in bed. "Go upstairs and fetch him," she ordered. Young Porter dressed the child and took him to a waiting cab. The only explanation given by Kate was that she intended taking the boy to her father's. The little cachet of Mrs. Thomas's belongings found in the dresses at the Rising Sun included a letter from her from a Mr. Menhinnick of Finsbury Park. On March 21st, John Church and Henry Porter called on Menhinnick and expressed their doubts and fears about the real Mrs. Thomas. Menhinnick, who had known Mrs. Thomas for 10 years, lost no time in contacting her solicitor, whose advice was to go to the police. The solicitor, William Hughes, together with Church and Porter, reported their suspicions to the Richmond police station. On the following day, led by Inspector John Pearman, the trio went to the Vine Cottages, where a search was made. A number of illuminating discoveries followed. There were some charred bones under the copper grate, and the remains of some burnt clothing. Numerous bloodstains were found in the kitchen and elsewhere. A chopper was discovered in the basement, and a razor in the scullery. Under the sink in the scullery, Pearman found the handle of a box and a length of cord. Most conveniently, a letter to Kate from her uncle in Ireland was found in the pocket of a dress she had left behind in the house. On March 23rd, Robert Porter identified the box in which the remains had been found, and a description of Kate, who was then known to have a criminal record, was circulated by the police. Wanted for stealing, plate, etc., and supposed murder of Mistress Kate blank, aged about 32, 5'5" or 6 inches high, complexion sallow, slightly freckled, teeth rather good and prominent, usually dressed in a dark dress, jacket rather long and trimmed with dark fur around the pockets, light brown satin bonnet, speaks with an Irish accent, and was accompanied by a boy aged 5, complexion rather dark hair, was last seen in Hammersmith. Kate's cunning had by now deserted her, for she had made straight for her home in Ireland. She thereby made the police's job easier, and in no time at all she was traced to her uncle's house at Culzean, where she was arrested on March 28th. Pending the arrival of officers from Scotland Yard, she was put in a cell in Enniscorthy jail. Inspectors John Dowdell and Henry Jones charged her next day with willfully murdering her mistress and with stealing furniture and other property. They then escorted her back to London, and during the storm-tossed passage between Dublin and Holyhead, Kate made a rambling statement which was punctuated by spells of seasickness. She asked Dowdell, "Is there any person in custody for murder?" His non-committal reply produced the response, "If there is not, there ought to be. It is very hard the innocent should suffer for the guilty." This was the prelude to her accusations against John Church, which she repeated in a statement made at Richmond Police Station on March 30th. In this statement, she claimed to have known him for 7 years and implied that he had led her astray. "He used to take me out to London and to various public houses." She alleged that she entertained him at the cottage, and when her mistress returned, he pretended he was Kate's brother. It was Church who supposedly talked threateningly. "Couldn't we put the old woman out of the way?" "What do you mean?" answers Kate with a hint of shock. "Oh, poison her," he says. Her statement goes on to describe in graphic detail how she returned to the cottage late in the evening to find Mrs. Thomas lying on the mat in the passage, struggling and groaning, with Church holding a carving knife. Kate recoils, feeling faint, and Church threatens her with the knife. "No, John, don't. I won't tell," she pleads. This blackening of Church's character shows the real Kate at work, quick-thinking, devious, and plausible. Her effort was sufficient to ensure Church's arrest, and, together with Kate, he was formally charged with murdering Mrs. Thomas. Fortunately, John Church had did a great deal earlier on to assist the police, and at the magistrate's court he was able to establish an alibi for the crucial periods. Henry Porter also proved a faithful and reliable friend. Realizing that events were slipping away from her, Kate made a second statement, this time implicating Henry Porter. She stated that both he and Church were at the cottage when the crime was committed, the date of which she moved back a day, probably to give her less time to account for. The tone of the second statement and the contradiction of earlier claims merely chipped away what little credibility Kate had left. She was hissed and booed by the crowds as she was escorted to and from the court in a cab. The charge against John Church was dropped, and he returned to a hero's welcome at the Rising Sun, where the premises were packed with friends and well-wishers glad to see him free of the clutches of the scheming Irishwoman. During the magistrate's hearing, Kate had kept calm for most of the part, but was driven to an outburst during Church's evidence when she accused him of improper behavior and called him a scoundrel. This confirmed Church's subsequent appearance as a waitress for the prosecution and did nothing to ameliorate Kate's position as the magistrate's court committed her for trial. Kate Webster and all her aliases appeared on trial before Mr. Justice Denman at the Central Criminal Court on July 2, 1879. The Solicitor General, Sir Hardinge Gifford, prosecuted, and the defense was conducted by Mr. Warner Slay. There was no doubt in the prosecutor's mind what had happened to Mrs. Thomas. "Notwithstanding every effort, the head has never been found," he said, "but the jury will entertain no doubt whatever that the human remains found in the box were the remains of Mrs. Thomas. The box in which these remains were found will be identified beyond all doubt. Referring to Kate's statements uttered with great deliberation and art, he has said they were apparently made with a view to account for what she knew would probably be discovered. Sir Hardinge exonerated Church and Porter. The facts are quite reconcilable with her having done the whole thing herself. She was quite capable of putting Mrs. Thomas to death. To have done all else, whether she had any assistance, is best known to herself. But that there is no imputation against the two men mentioned, the jury will be satisfied. That the murder was planned was borne out by Mary Durden, a bonnet and hat maker who lived at Kingston. She had known Kate for 4 years and said, "I saw her on Shrove Tuesday the 25th of February at my house. She told me she was going to Birmingham to see about some property which her aunt had left. She told me that she had a letter from her aunt telling her where to find her gold watch and chain and her jewels, and everything her aunt had was to come to her." This conversation took place while Kate was working out her notice at Vine Cottage, and 6 days before Mrs. Thomas disappeared. The Solicitor General concluded his opening speech with a damning catalogue of Kate's activities. Quote, "On the facts being put before you, you will have no difficulty in coming to the conclusion that Mrs. Thomas, who was last seen alive on the 2nd of March at 7:30 in the evening, has never been seen alive since. That the dead body of a female was taken away from the house on the Tuesday following. That the person who, in fact, exercised dominion over the body and disposed of it is the prisoner at the bar. That the person who affected and claimed dominion over the effects, who took possession of them and treated them as her own, is the prisoner at the bar. That the person who was in possession of a black bag which had disappeared, and which she herself could trace, is the person at the bar. That she was the only person in the house so far as independent testimony was concerned, and is the only person of all whom she herself mentioned and who absconded. That she has made statements quite inconsistent with each other, and which you judge whether, apart from any other explanation or proof, all the circumstances do not point as dumb witnesses against the prisoner at the bar." There, following a procession of prosecution, witnesses each giving measured support to the various aspects of the incident, Henry Porter showed how he had been completely taken in by Kate. Quote, "I did not go to the police and give information when the box was found in the river. I had a suspicion after my son told me it was like the box, but I did not give information because I did not suspect the accused in the least. It was young Robert who cast the seeds of doubt in the Porter household after reading about the Barnes mystery in the newspaper. He told his mother, 'Why, I carried a box for Kate,' and then with growing conviction, 'That is the box I carried over the bridge.' John Church's affiliation with Kate cost him dearly, and he had to claw back his reputation in the witness box by denying her damaging allegations, not least of which was that of infidelity. The number of his visits to Vine Cottages seemed excessive for the small amount of business involved, and he seemed careless with his reputation in staying late and drinking with Kate. Despite the spell she put on him, he behaved with commendable judgment when the crisis came over the removing of the furniture. In concluding his evidence, he told the judge, 'No complaints have ever been made against me during the 9 years I have been in the house, the Rising Sun, and I was not particularly wild before I enlisted. I was sometime knocking about. I had not gone into any scrape. Happily, his good name was rescued. His only lapse was being taken in by remarkably wily women.' Dr. Thomas Bond was called to give evidence regarding the human remains, which it had fallen to him to try to piece together. At various times he was given the contents of the wooden box, the foot retrieved from the manure heap, and a carpet bag containing some partially burned bones. The result of reassembling these scattered remnants indicated that they all belonged to the same body. You were unable to recognize among these any duplicates of those you had already found in the box? Asked the counsel. None at all, answered the doctor. There was no fragment of any skull that you could discern? None at all. Possibly hoping that the head, if it had been thrown into the river, might yet turn up, counsel inquired. Will the head float by itself? No. Were the divisions of the bones made by sawing, such as might have been produced by an ordinary meat saw? Quite so. There was some discrepancy over putting an age to the body. Dr. Adams had said at the inquest that he put the age of the woman between 18 and 30. This opened a small gap for the defense, as Mrs. Thomas was in her mid-50s. Dr. Bond disagreed with his colleague's estimate. Oh, no. I am sure that is wrong. The judge asked, You are sure it was an older woman? I am sure it was a woman older than that. You put it as a woman over 50? Yes. Mr. Slay tried to shake the doctor in cross-examination over the age and height of the body. After all, he pointed out the remains were incomplete. Half of the pelvis was missing, as were some of the ribs and the lower portion of the body. Therefore, he suggested, you have no means of judging the real height of the person by actual measurement. Dr. Bond admitted that he was correct. Defense counsel now moved on to another attack. There was not the slightest means of finding out how she came by her death, whether she died naturally or by violence? None at all, answered the doctor. A woman may die from heart disease, as we know, or apoplexy, or she may burst a blood vessel and die from vomiting or hemorrhage. Dr. Bond, who used an economy of words in witness box, replied, Quite so. Counsel was leading up to the suggestion that Mrs. Thomas's flushed and excited state when she arrived late at church, with her bonnet askew, might be considered premonitory symptoms of a hemorrhage. The doctor agreed that this conjecture was possible. The Solicitor General asked for Kate's statements to be read out in court, a duty which was carried out by the clerk of arraigns, and he recalled some of the earlier witnesses to refute parts of them. That done, the prosecution's case was completed, and Mr. Warner Slay rose from his seat to address the jury on behalf of the accused. He faced a daunting task and had little material with which to fashion any useful defense. Nevertheless, he fully exploited the few avenues open to him, and in the best traditions of British justice, the accused, with all the odds stacked against her, was given a spirited defense. He told the jury that before they could convict the woman in the dock of willful murder, they must have excluded all hypotheses that Mrs. Thomas died from natural causes. The first issue was whether the bones found are the bones of Mrs. Thomas. The jury might have a mortal belief and might imagine they must be the bones of Mrs. Thomas. But that would not be sufficient. At every step in the case there must be legal proof. What proof was there that the bones found were that of Mrs. Thomas? Counsel emphasized the difference of opinion between the doctors who had examined the bones and dealt with the subject at considerable length. As regards the manner of her death, Mr. Slay referred to the argument he had to put to Dr. Bond, and which he accepted as possible, that Mrs. Thomas' excited behavior might have presaged death from natural causes. In the fact of such medical evidence, he said, would the jury undertake to say that Mrs. Thomas did not die by an act of God? Kate's defender was trying to make bricks without straw, and he embarked on even more uncertain ground when he spoke of his client's kindly nature. Kate Webster had a child of which she was undoubtedly fond. She was proud to have been a person of motherly and womanly instincts. Sarah Creese and Lucy Loder had spoken of Kate as a kind, good-hearted woman, and Kate herself was known to have referred to Mrs. Thomas in terms of endearment and respect. "Were not these things worth considering before the jury sent a woman to the gallows?" he questioned. Having thus tried to rehabilitate Kate's character, defense counsel pointed his finger of suspicion at John Church, who was not above meeting the accused in the street and going into a public house with her. He argued that Church had confused some of the dates in his evidence and had an alibi which was not above reproach. The jury were asked whether the evidence had not been exaggerated for the purpose of relieving Church and Porter from the liability of answering a very serious charge. He thought they would find it difficult to believe that after the box had been found in the river, and there was much talk about the Barnes mystery, with the Porters reading a newspaper account on the 9th of March that nothing was said to the police. There was the extraordinary fact of the box being carried to Richmond Bridge on the night of March the 4th. Could they believe that the boy kept it from his father until March 23rd? He continued that the whole fabric of the evidence had been endeavored to be made up by these people, but in an attempt to make it up, they contradicted themselves. Finally, Mr. Slay appealed to the jury. Kate Webster was standing at their judgment, at their mercy. Would they not believe her story told in the first blush of the moment rather than that of the witnesses for the prosecution? It was a gallant effort of defense counsel's part. Sir Hardinge Gifford replied carefully, emphasizing the strong points of the prosecution's case. He called attention to the fact that it was Church and Porter who alerted the police and supplied the information which started the investigation. There was no doubt as to the identity of the person who pretended that she was Mrs. Thomas, who set about disposing of her property and who gave false accounts of herself. The trial was in its sixth day, when Mr. Justice Denman, beginning his charge to the jury, reminded the court that they were approaching the termination of this long, laborious, and important case. His summing up was fair. Referring to Kate's statements, he said, "If you come to the conclusion that these statements are obviously made with the motive of screening herself at the expense of others, and are obviously untrue in many material particulars, it is idle to conceal from yourselves that the effect of that must be strongly to corroborate the case for the prosecution instead of shaking it." The judge upheld Church's good character and said that attempts to question his uprightness as a young man had no bearing on that case. Porter he referred to as a hard-working man and left no doubt in anyone's mind that the chief witnesses for the prosecution were reliable. The jury retired at 12 minutes past 5 on Tuesday the 8th of July and returned into court just over an hour later. To the time-honored, formally phrased question regarding their verdict on the accused, the foreman of the jury uttered the one word, "Guilty." "Catherine Webster, you stand convicted of willful murder," declared the clerk of the court. "Have you anything to say for yourself why the court should not give you the judgment according to the law?" Kate, finally trapped, denied her guilt, but cleared Church and Porter. Although she could not resist casting blame, she said, "I am not guilty, my lord, of the murder. I have never done it, my lord. When I was taken into custody, I was in a hurry, and I made a statement against Church and Porter. I am sorry for doing so, and I want to clear them out of it. And another thing, I was led to this, my lord. The man who is guilty of all this is not in the case at all, nor never was. Therefore, I do not see why I should suffer for what other people have done. There was a child put in my hands in 1874. I had to thieve for that child and go to prison for it, which can be brought up to your lordship. Anybody can tell it round Kingston or Richmond too. Therefore the father of that child is the ruin of me since 1873, up to this moment, and he is the instigation of this. He was never taken into custody. I have cherished him up to this minute, but I do not see why I should suffer for a scoundrel who has left me after what he has done. Commenting on Kate's allegations when he passed sentence, the judge observed, "Whether your statement now be true or not, God only can tell. After so many false statements as you have made, it must not be assumed to be true as a matter of course." Mr. Justice Denman then passed the sentence of death. In answer to the usual question to the prisoner as to whether she had anything to say in stay of execution, Kate pleaded pregnancy. The matron of the prison stated that this was untrue, and a jury of matronly ladies assembled from those present in the court was asked to inquire into the claim. Dr. Bond was requested to examine Kate in the jury room, and he reported that the prisoner was not quick with child, a conclusion which the jury of the matrons endorsed. If any proof were needed, this was ample demonstration of the reliability which could be placed on Kate's various statements. So she tried saying, "Oh, I'm pregnant, don't kill me." Sorry. Kate was returned to Wandsworth Prison to await her execution, which was fixed on July 19, 1879. The prison at that time did not have a condemned cell, so Kate was lodged in an ordinary cell near the infirmary. 2 female warders supervised her night and day, and her spiritual welfare was looked after by Father Mainery, the prison's Roman Catholic chaplain. A sister of compassion from the convent at Hammersmith assisted him in this task. Perhaps they had been forewarned by the authorities at Newgate of Kate's defiant nature and appalling language when she had been confined there. Captain Colville, governor of Wandsworth, was deluged with letters from the public offering righteous opinions as to how his prisoner could be brought to a state of grace. On July 10th, Kate made a confession, which in her inimitable manner she enlarged on a few days later. In the hope of gaining a reprieve, she heavily implicated an unnamed man in the murder. This was presumed to be Strong, whom she had similarly involved, though not by name, in her statement at the trial. Presumably Strong must have satisfied the police regarding his relationship with Kate. Even so, it is surprising that he was not called to give evidence, especially as he was seen with her a few days before Mrs. Thomas's disappeared. There was a small body of opinion which professed some doubt about Kate's guilt, and following a public meeting at Kensington, a formal request was made to the Home Secretary for commutation of sentence. This was turned down, and with all hope now gone, Kate made a full confession of her guilt on the eve of the execution. This is given in the full, as there is little doubt that it describes exactly what happened. And here it is now. I made a statement in the presence of the warders to Mr. O'Brien, my solicitor, on the 10th of July, and a second statement in the presence of the warders to my said solicitor, Mr. O'Brien, on the 17th of July, both in reference to the Richmond murder. These statements were untrue in many ways, especially that portion of them which referred to the murder of Mrs. Thomas and the man Strong, whom I named the last one, and I am now informed by Mr. O'Brien, my solicitor, that the memorial presented on my behalf has not been successful, and I will be executed at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, July 29th. I see, therefore, that there is no visible hope for a respite of my sentence, and I am advised by him and feel that I am bound in the sight of the Almighty God to clear everyone of suspicion, and especially those whose names were mentioned in my said statements. Before I die, which I am now happy in doing, in the first place, I heartily beg God's forgiveness and mercy for numerous falsehoods I have told throughout this unfortunate case, especially because they affected the character and reputations of persons whose names are mentioned, and secondly, because of the injury they have done to myself in the sight of the Almighty God, whose mercy and forgiveness I have no doubt of having obtained. Since I was arrested, I was always in dread of the consequence of the crime, and although I had all the assistance of my solicitor, who exercised every possible means, both before and after my trial, to rescue me from my untimely end, yet I had my doubts that I should escape the penalty which I must now pay to the law. I was inwardly unhappy throughout, but bore up under such a terrible trial with the greatest fortitude and courage I possibly could. But when I was approaching the day of my execution, and fearing that nothing could be done to save me, I immediately requested the governor to send for me Mr. O'Brien, my solicitor, that I might open my mind and reveal all the things to him immediately, without the slightest hesitation or reserve, which I now proceed to do, knowing well that I have no hope of mercy in this world. With respect to the death of Mrs. Thomas, the circumstances surrounding the murder of that lady are as follows. I entered the lady's service in the month of January. At first I thought her a nice old lady, and imagined I could be comfortable and happy with her. But I found her very trying. She used to do many things to annoy me. When I had finished my work in the room, she used to go over it and point out places where she said I did not clean, thus showing evidence of a nasty spirit towards me. This sort of conduct made me have an ill feeling towards her, but I had no intention of killing her, at least not then. One day I had an altercation with her, and we mutually arranged I should leave her service, and she made an entrance to that effect in her memorandum book. On Sunday evening, 2nd March last, Mrs. Thomas and I were alone in the house. We had some argument at which she and myself were enraged, and she became very agitated and left the house to go to church in that state, leaving me at home. Upon which her return from the church, before her usual hour, she came in and went upstairs. I went up after her, and we had an argument which ripened into a quarrel, and in the height of my anger and rage I threw her from the top of the stairs to the ground floor. She had a heavy fall. I felt that she was seriously injured, and I became agitated at what had happened, lost all control of myself, and to prevent her screaming or getting me into trouble, I caught her by the throat, and in the struggle she was choked. I threw her on the floor. I then became entirely lost and without any control over myself, and looking on what had happened, in the fear of being discovered, I determined to do away with the body as best I could. I chopped the head from the body, with the assistance of a razor, which I used to cut through the flesh afterwards. I also used the meat saw and the carving knife to cut the body up with. I prepared the copper with water to boil the body to prevent identity, and as soon as I had succeeded in cutting it up, I placed it in the copper and boiled it. I opened the stomach with the carving knife, and burned up as much of the parts as I could. During the whole of this time there was nobody in the house but myself. When I looked upon the scene before me and saw the blood around my feet, the horror and dread I felt was inconceivable. I was bewildered, acted as if I was mad, and did everything I possibly could to conceal the occurrence, keep it quiet and everything regular. Fearing the neighbors might suspect something had happened, I was greatly overcome, both from the horrible sight before me and the smell, and I failed several times in my strength and determination, but was helped on by the devil in his vile purpose. I remained in the house all night, endeavoring to clear up the place and clean away the traces of murder. I burned one part of the body after chopping it up, and boiled the other. I think I boiled one of the feet. I emptied the copper, throwing the water away after having washed and cleaned the outside. I then put parts of the body into the little wooden box, which was produced in court, and I tied it up with cord and determined to deposit it in the Thames, which was afterwards done in the manner already described with the help of young Porter. I remember the coal man, Mr. Dean, coming to the house and knocking at the door. I was greatly frightened, but in dread of creating suspicion, I opened the door to answer him, and spoke to him, as he stated in his evidence. When he called, I was engaged in regulating the place, and was in a dreadful state of mind. I also recall a young lady calling at the house about the repairs, and I answered her in the manner she gave in her evidence. I put the head of Mrs. Thomas in the black bag, and being weary and afraid to remain in the house, I carried it to the Porter's and had some tea there. I placed the bag with the head in it under the tea table, and afterwards took it away from the house and disposed of it in the way and in the place I have described to my solicitor, Mr. O'Brien. The deposition of this black bag gave me great uneasiness, as I feared it might be discovered, and the identity of Mrs. Thomas thereby proven. And when I heard that a black bag had been found, I was greatly troubled. I pretended to Mr. O'Brien that the bag contained nothing of the kind. The foot found in the dunghill at the Kingston was placed there by me. For when I came to realize the true state of things and the great danger I stood in, I resolved to do everything in my power to keep everything secret and prevent being discovered. When I placed the box in the river and disposed of the head and other parts of the body as best as I could, and cleared up the place so that a person coming in might not suspect or see anything irregular, it was suggested to my mind to sell all that there was in the house and go away. With that view, I went and saw Porter, and introduced the sale of the things to him. He accompanied me to the churches, and we bargained for the sale in the manner set forth in the evidence given at the trial respecting that part of the transaction. I gave the chairs to Porter as a gift, and also kept ordering things for the house from the tradespeople in order to evade suspicion. There is no truth in the evidence given by Miss Ives that she heard men talking in the house on Monday night, or the voice of a woman calling Lizzie. Mrs. Ives is mistaken, that part of the evidence, as there was nobody in the house but myself, and the statement I made that Strong and a woman were there in the house is untrue. I made these statements to save myself, if possible, from my perilous position. At the time of the murder, I took possession of Mrs. Thomas's gold watch and chain, and also of all the money in the house, which was only 7 or 8 pounds. I accompanied Church to the watchmaker's and asked for Mrs. Thomas's watch. Church only paid me £13, not 18, as stated. He made me a present of earrings, and the evidence as to my borrowing a sovereign from Mrs. Church is correct. I threw the dresses and bonnet of Thomas's into the van, which was brought to fetch the furniture, and they were taken to the Churches. I thought of getting rid of them in the best manner I could. When I left Church's house in the evening, after the sale of the furniture was stopped, I determined to proceed to Ireland at once to avoid being discovered, but I was not surprised at being arrested. I did not murder Mrs. Thomas from any premeditation. I was enraged and in a passion, and I cannot now recollect why I did it. Something seemed to seize me at the time. I threw her downstairs in the heat of passion and strong impulse. I acted towards her as I have described. I never had a hatred, or what may be termed a bad feeling towards anybody in my lifetime, certainly not such as would ever have induced me to do them bodily injury. And I cannot account for the awful feelings that came over me from the time Mrs. Thomas came home from church until the murder was completed. It is true, I went by the name of Mrs. Thomas, and that I wore her gold watch, and with regard to the false teeth, I took them from Mrs. Thomas and gave them to Porter to sell, the proceeds of which he gave me, except 1 shilling which I gave him. I have now relieved my mind by making a full sincere confession that myself, without help or assistance of any person whatsoever, committed the murder. I have accounted for it and described it in this statement to the best of my power and recollection. I heartily exonerate everyone from having any hand or part in it. When I got in trouble in Liverpool, it was owing in a great measure to poverty and evil associations, which led me step by step into badness. When I got over that trouble, I formed an intimate acquaintance with one who should have protected me. And being led away by evil associates and bad companions, I became, as it were, forlorn, and forsook everything that might have kept me in the path of rectitude and prevented my unhappy end. I was afraid to make known the real state of things to my solicitor, lest he might have abandoned my case and taken no interest in it. I therefore concealed the truth from him until I sent for him. When he told me of the reply to the memorial sent up for me, I then fully and candidly confessed to him, at the last moment, the whole of the facts, in order that everything might be cleared up, and that I alone should be blamed. I am perfectly resigned to my fate, and I am full of confidence in a happy eternity. If I had a choice, I would almost sooner die than return to a life full of misery, deception, and wickedness. I die with great fortitude and confidence in my faith and in our blessed God, whom I beseech to have mercy on my soul. Kate Webster. Having got this off her chest and apparently expecting the salvation of her soul, she told Father M'Enery that she felt greatly relieved. She also said she would now sleep more calmly during her last night on earth. Not that she had been noticed suffering from loss of sleep or appetite while she had been subjected to the regime of the condemned. One of the pictorial newspapers pictured Kate's dream on the night before her execution, in which she is visited by the spirit of Mrs. Thomas. In her conscience, if her conscience was troubled, it didn't show. She went to bed at 10 p.m. and slept well until 5 a.m. The next morning, then, she was visited by the prison governor as the first act in the countdown to the scaffold. The prison bell started to toll at 8:45, and Kate, leaning on the arm of Father M'Enery, was led to the gallows into the hands of Marwood the executioner. Marwood. I don't know why that's a good name for an executioner. Marwood. She was quickly pinioned for the drop, and Kate's last words uttered loudly were, "Lord, have mercy upon me." The black flag was raised at the prison and fluttered menacingly above the small crowd gathered outside the gates. The day after the execution, Mrs. Thomas's effects were sold at Vine Cottages. The principal buyer was John Church, who seemed to have thrown off any stigma attached to them after the trial. He bought Mrs. Thomas's gold watch and chain and the carving knife, which Kate allegedly used to cut up her victim. The copper in which the pieces of the body were boiled was sold to an unknown buyer for 5 shillings. Kate Webster's dark-clad and sinister likeness frightened visitors in Madame Tussaud's for many years. I ain't gonna lie, man. I wonder where all that murderabilia is, dude. That needs to be in like a museum or at least someone who collects murderabilia. I'm curious about that. Reviled as she was for her brutal crime, her lies, and her low cunning, Kate at least had the redeeming feature of caring for her child. She also left a revolting possibility for the lovers of the macabre. According to the proprietress of the Hole in the Wall public house, a few days after Mrs. Thomas disappeared, Kate did a round of the neighbors offering for sale 2 bowls of fat, which she had announced were the best dripping. Ha ha! So there you go. That's the story of Kate Webster. I hope you all enjoyed, and you all have a good day.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.